right, well, good afternoon. I'm Raina Edgar. I am the Director of Education and Programs at the Arkansas Arts Center, and on behalf of our staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Just a reminder, please keep your microphones on mute. This will make it easier to hear the speakers today. And also, we will take Q&A at the end. If you want to type in any questions during the presentation in the chat feature, please feel free to do that, and we will read those questions at the end of the talk today. Before we begin, I do want to take a moment to thank our supporters. This exhibition is supported by Ms. Lizzie and Rockefeller, Terry and Chuck Irwin, Judy Fletcher in memory of John R. Fletcher, Friday Eldridge and Clark, LLP, J.C. Thompson Trust, Diane and Bobby Tucker, the AAC Contemporaries, Bank OZK, Phyllis and Michael Barrier, East Harding Construction, Marion W. Folk, Barbara House, Don Tilton, the Andre Simon Memorial Trust, and memory of everyone who has died of acquired immune deficiency syndrome, and the grand award is supported by the John William Lynn Endowment Fund. I'd also like to recognize our partners for the Delta exhibition this year: Historic Arkansas Museum, VIA Foundation, Lehman Library, and Akansa. It's just a reminder that on August 18th, we will have our final virtual artist conversation. If you're interested in joining that, please register on our website. It is a pleasure to introduce to you today Louis Watts. Louis is a Burlington, North Carolina-based artist. He earned his MFA from UNC Chapel Hill in 2017 and his BFA from Arizona State University in 2007. Louis is originally from Little Rock and is a Central High School graduate. His mom actually worked at the Arkansas Arts Center in the mid-90s, and Louis interned for the Arts Center in the exhibitions department in 2006. His work has been exhibited in numerous galleries, and his work is even part of the collection at the Arkansas Arts Center. Louis currently serves as the gallery curator and manager of 111, a contemporary art gallery in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and runs his own independent curatorial project, Gutterbox, as well in North Carolina. Today, Louis will be in conversation with Brian Lang. Brian is the Chief Curator and Windgate Foundation Curator of Contemporary Craft at the Arkansas Arts Center. In his capacity, he leads a team of 7 and directs all matters related to exhibitions and collections. And I will turn it over to Brian and Louis.
Thank you, Raina.
Thanks.
Thank you, Louis, for joining us today.
Sure.
It's really an honor for me. I've been with the Arts Center since 2012, so as a curator, it's very fulfilling and rewarding to see an artist continue to be accepted into an exhibition like the Delta, and how you have continued to evolve, and we'll explore that a little bit further in the talk. But if we can go to the next, this is the work that's in the current Delta, and we'll, do you want to talk about this now or come back to it a little later?
I think we'll circle back to it.
Okay.
I did, just for people watching, because we'll talk about it later, scale. Here's the actual piece.
Cool.
So you can see how
Thanks.
the actual physical scale of it. But we'll come back to it.
So let's go to the next slide and talk about these two works briefly, and kind of your reminiscences of the Arts Center and the collection, and just inspirations.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the Arts Center, I'm originally from Little Rock again, and my dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot, but then we moved back in the mid-90s, so I was in like middle school, and my mom started working there and befriended Tom Hall, who was the head of exhibitions department and lead registrar, and then got to know Townsend Wolf, who was the director at the time. So I had this early exposure to the Arts Center, and through those relationships actually got to like see the drawing collection during like my formative years. So I've always kind of felt like the Arts Center was like my true arts education, and it happened sort of subconsciously almost, like just spending time in the art center all the time to meet my mom or whatever, and just getting to like casually take in these artworks, I think really just informed my practice a lot. And then I just pulled these two images because I was looking through the digitized collection on the Art Center's website and just wanted to pull a couple images that like tapped some sort of memory bank. And we traced back that this was on exhibit 96 at the, what was the name of the show? The Large Works?
Large Drawings.
Yeah, so that one, I guess, left an impression on me then. And then I think the Georgia O'Keeffe, I probably, I don't want to get ahead of myself too much, but when I took a semester off school to do an internship at the Art Center. And I think that's probably when I really spent the most time with that piece in particular.
Well, it's one of the key works in our collection, and it's interesting in that you would be drawn to this in its figural and representation and approach, and you don't really work that way,
No.
or at least that I've known. So
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my work, like maybe not formally the relationships there, but I think in terms of just like the lusciousness of like the blacks in this drawing, sort of the physicality of that, the actual medium of drawing in this piece, I think is what kind of speaks to me. Yeah.
And did the scale of the other work kind of speak to you? Because you are, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, you do work in a larger scale. And then with the most current work, I think that's a good contrast, the diminutiveness of it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I would, to a certain degree, I remember seeing the Richard Serra drawing Respective at the Met. I think that was in 2009, something like that. I lived in New York for a little while, and I only bring that up just because when I was at that exhibit, I realized it's kind of rare to encounter large scale drawings. And so one of the things that pulls me to drawing versus other medias is just the physicality of drawing versus the layering process of like painting, for instance. And there's something about it when it's expanded and you just have these large swaths of graphite or charcoal that like the physicality of the drawing itself really, I mean, it's like impossible to sort of overlook. So I think definitely a piece like this would have like immediately had an impact on me in that respect.
So you saw this drawing on the left in 96, but also if we move to the next slide, that was, I think, your first introduction to the Delta as well, yes?
Roughly. I threw this slide in there. I primarily because my mom was in this Delta, so this one, she had a piece in it. I think it won honorable mention. It was a small ceramic sculpture. And so I was trying to track down that image and found this image of Greeley Myatt, who is in this year's Delta, which is awesome. And I really remember this piece specifically, but overall the Delta, like the collection was sort of my exposure to art in general, or at least on a consistent basis. And I feel like the Delta exhibition when I was younger was my exposure to working artists and more contemporary art practices. So I've always held the Delta exhibition in high esteem just because, like the Art Center overall, it really was formative for me. And so it was my, in Little Rock, there's not a huge amount of exposure to working in contemporary arts. So the Delta just really always was special to me. And that's why I continue to try to apply every year and be a part of the exhibition every year. So, but yeah, I think definitely this is one of the earlier ones that I remember going to.
And what specifically about this work? Was it the conceptual nature? Was it the orderliness of the springs and the steel, which evokes the grid? Am I
think
reading too much into it? I don't know.
For my, I think I would have been in 6th grade. So at that time, I think it was just like like I was so used to seeing drawings like George O'Keeffe or something in the museum than to encounter just where it was leaning against a wall. That was sort of like, what is this? How am I supposed to approach this? So I think the fact that it was just an early encounter with the work of art that made you sort of question what that meant in the first place. I think that's what stuck out in my memory about it.
And then you said you were in 6th grade, but you went on to study at Little Rock Central High School, and you pursued art there as well. And
I did. I originally started high school at Catholic High, and there wasn't really much of an art program there. I think there was a club, but there weren't like organized classes, and that was sort of the arguing point that I was able to use to convince my parents to let me go to Central, which is where I grew up. I was in the Central district. And yeah, so I transferred there and finished my 11th and 12th grade there and took art classes there. Senior year, I had Mr. Anthony, who was an awesome teacher. And I think he wrote me a recommendation I applied to Savannah College of Art and Design, decided not to go, but I think he wrote me a recommendation at that time. So yeah.
Good. So moving on to the next slide, you did end up going to Arizona State.
I did, yes. And when I was there, I put this in for a couple of reasons, just sort of as a holding slide while I talked about going to school. But while I was there, I also worked at the Arizona State Art Museum. And throughout my career from that point on, I've held a job in the arts in some capacity. And I think that has been pretty influential on my practice overall, just because I tend to think, like when I'm developing my own concepts, I sort of think what sort of relationships they might have with like art historical moments or whatever. I tend to hit like mid-century era artworks a lot, which makes sense because the age I'm at, working in museums, that's sort of what was like a lot of the exhibits revolved around. But yeah, when I went to Arizona State, I originally was studying intermedia. So my focus was doing more like installation, large scale artworks with multimedia aspects to it. And then if you go to the next slide, I studied abroad and I had to take a semester off because my credits weren't transferring or something. And so I took that time and interned at the Art Center. And that time when I became like reacquainted with the drawing collection really made me sort of shift my focus of my own practice onto drawing. And this was when I kind of considered this piece to be like the pivot point. And it has a lot in relationship with these Ship Minerva pieces, because it took me like 6 months to do this. I was just doing like little, I was digging into the paper with graphite, and it took me forever. I actually gave myself carpal tunnel, and it was a bad experience because I didn't know what I was doing or how to do it. But I consider this drawing when I shifted my practice into drawing, which it still to this day is mainly informed or driven by drawing.
But from a technical perspective too, did you have something laid down so you didn't smudge the graphite from your palm, or?
I think I just used another piece of paper, like I think a piece of tracing paper or something thin. And then I also just worked from the top left corner to right, sort of down, same sort of way I work with the Ship Minerva, so it kind of minimized rubbing on the part that was already like filled in.
Did you know where you were going, or was it a very iterative process?
Yes,
as far as the pattern goes, and
yeah, the reason it's called Arkansas Geologic is it's a cropped section of the geologic map of Arkansas that I traced out. Took all the color-coded parts out and then just filled in each area with these little spirals of graphite. So when you see it in person, you can kind of see it in the overall picture on the left, but you can see these sort of like striations and sort of strata or whatever that, if you are familiar with the geologic map of Arkansas, you can roughly see where it turns from Ozarks in the northwest to Delta Plain on the right.
And place really has a role in all of the various series in one way or another, and we'll touch on that. Did you submit this to a Delta that year or no?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't quite connected that. I mean, this is my thesis, in my thesis show of my undergraduate. So I think I was just too much thinking about school and I wasn't thinking about that yet. But in the next slide, that was the year, or this is the year after I graduated. And this is my first Delta I entered and had a piece in. And so you can see very much informed by the drawing collection at the Art Center, and very much informed just by the physicality of charcoal and chalk.
Yeah, you have that very low horizon, and then just that burst of light, and then the upward light. I mean, it almost looks like it could be the bluffs across the river, yet also these iceberg forms, or.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had earlier on in my career, I really had references to landscape forms. I more or less lost that a little bit. I think it's actually kind of referenced in this series, or this iteration of the Ship Minerva series with the signage, because it sort of implies a lack of landscape from the vantage point looking up at these signs, these highway signs. But yeah.
And then in the next appearance for you, the 53rd, well, no, actually, if we go to the next slide, this is the 56th Delta, so 5 years later.
Yeah.
You've completely gone geometric abstraction.
Yeah, it's definitely a big change up from the last slide. And yeah, I was in a couple more Deltas in between, and the work kind of jumped forward a few years here. But I thought this is the piece that the Art Center acquired in 2015, I think. And I thought it would be a good piece to talk about in terms of, I work largely in series, and this is a series that's been ongoing for almost a decade now. And I thought it'd be a good sort of series to talk about just in terms of general approaches that I take to working. So yeah, this was made in 2014, roughly, and it's made with archival bookbinding tape, which I brought a package of here. So these are my tools that I make this kind of work with. It's just archival bookbinding tape, some silk thread, and a little bone thing to burnish the tape down so it won't pull off. But, I mean, it's literally just a roll of tape. It's just used for if your book cover's falling off, tape it back on. And so if you go to the next slide, this is sort of a point of reference. The title is Yes, Yes, which is actually, if you jump to the next slide, this is the very early phases of this series. And I was working at an art college, the Cornish College of Art in Seattle at the time. And my job was basically sourcing materials for the foundations department. So it was a lot of basic crafting materials, lots of tapes and threads and basic crafting, art making materials. And so I was kind of surrounded by that, but most of my job was just sitting at my desk. And I just literally started pulling these things I had around me and making these quick drawings without really trying to not think about it too much and just let it happen with what I was surrounded by. And if you go back to that Hans Art piece, I was just thinking about early Zurich Dada and their sort of focus on chance and just cheap materials that you're surrounded by. And so I thought there was a nice relationship there, and that sort of informed the name Yes Yes, because one of the like theories on where the Dada name comes from is the German for yes yes, which would have been ja ja. So from Dada to ja ja to yes yes. So, and then if you go forward 2, I guess, this is as it's moving along through the years, and not by much, but like, so this is when I started incorporating string into the work and kind of coming back to like the physicality of drawing. I like the immediacy of it in terms of like a record keeping device, in the sense that it's almost impossible to divorce the physical finished project from the movements that the artist made while making it. It's sort of like that Jackson Pollock action painting style where you're actually looking at a recorded history. And so the idea of using string as a line and then just using tape to like literally sort of suspend that moment in time on the paper just kind of fascinated me. And then
that's the clear tape, and then some masking tape as well, which is that slightly yellow, and then using the side of a graphite stick or a pencil, you're adding that graphite shading as well.
I think this one is a little older, so it's not that far removed from that previous slide, and that's why you see like charcoal just kind of tucked up in the tape. I wasn't quite as like over concerned about being clean. But I think it was charcoal powder that I would wipe on top to sort of just highlight the tape and then erase it off the tape there to sort of push the negative space a little more. But yeah, that's just masking tape. So at this time, I was really not super concerned with archival materials. I think that's probably just like true Scotch tape. So luckily the paper is kind of off-white, so the yellowing maybe it's not too bad today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the scale of this work?
That one's pretty small. I would say it's just judging on the tape size, it's probably 4 by 6 or 5 by 7 inches.
Okay.
Yeah. Because if you go to the next slide, this is that I finished this year that's within the same series, and that's made with scrapbook tape, which I have here. It's the same size as Scotch tape, so this scale of this tape in here is the same scale of the tape in that previous one, and this one's 24 inches tall by 48 inches wide. And if you go to the next slide, it gives you a little detail shot of this, so you can, in the right detail, you can kind of see it's weft yarn, which is like an unfinished yarn that's suspended below the tape.
And that's actually a work on paper. I think you said this was acrylic paint.
Yeah, so it's BFK printmaking paper that's mounted to panel, and then I do the tape and string part. Then when I'm finished with that, and normally in the past I would have done that dark black with the charcoal, but I found this really nice matte black acrylic paint that when the paper soaks it in, you almost get that nice lush black that you get from charcoal. It's not quite as good, but I'm also like sometimes just get really tired of having charcoal powder everywhere and dealing with it. So
when did you start working with well, I guess through the thread you incorporated color, punctuated these works with a little bit of color, but is it more recent that you've started to use acrylic paint?
Yes, definitely. I would say even within like the past year or so. I used to be even more stringent about only using charcoal or graphite, which I guess isn't even true as I say that, thinking back to those yes drawings, I was using tape and string and stuff. So, but in terms, I think I was kind of hung up, and might still be, to be honest, hung up on the idea of drawing having to have this charcoal or graphite involved. And one of the reasons I like those materials is because they are so primal, like they're ancient charcoal mixed in with some sort of suspension device. But so I really like it's just an actual element that you're drawing with. But again, just it's such a pain, and sometimes I just want to try something out, see what it's like to work clean. But we'll see how long it lasts. I might switch back.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you see yourself continuing to maybe use acrylic, or it'll just depend on the work? And
it depends. Yeah, I primarily will stick to drawing materials, but occasionally I'll use some acrylic here and there. So.
But if we move to the next slide, we'll actually see something from your past that also uses color, at least on the inside.
Yeah,
you were ahead of the food truck, and you had an art truck.
It's true. Yeah, I built this. I was living in Northwest Arkansas, working at Crystal Bridges at the time, and I built this truck out. If you go to the next slide, you can see the interior a little better. I built this truck out, I guess it was 2014. I think I started it in 2014 and had the first exhibit in the fall of 2014. And then this exhibit was in I guess it was the winter of 2015. And I would just literally park it across the street from 21C and just be like, hey, check this out. So these pieces in here are from the Yes Yes series. I didn't really include a detail of them, but they have embroidery floss that's suspended with the bookbinding tape on panel. And then that all is charcoal.
That is charcoal, okay.
It's two different kinds of charcoals. Like on that piece in the left image on the back, the darker charcoal is a compressed charcoal, and the sort of surrounding space of the shape is a layered powdered charcoal technique. And then this sort of shows where like my undergrad interest with installation art can sort of meets my focus on drawing. This is kind of the sweet spot that if in an ideal world, if I could, get exhibits any and everywhere, I would sort of work in this mode most of the time. But it's really hard to do full room installation. So that was one of my like driving forces of building out this truck, was to just have space that I could do stuff like this in. But then I had to sell the truck to pay for rent when I was in grad school. So doesn't make it anymore.
I think you said you sold a painting to some collectors in Miami, or
yeah.
one of these people.
But not one of these, but the first show in the truck art, I set up so it was a silent auction through the whole show. And it was, they had come for a exhibit at Crystal Bridges and came into the truck and ended up buying a piece. That was actually the first larger piece from the Ship Minerva series.
So completely different from this. But before we move on, you said this was 2014, I think?
2014, yeah.
But the year previous to that, in 2013, you had one of those installation type pieces in the Delta called Cylinder and Pyramid. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we have an image of that because I had forgotten it, but that was actually the first Delta during my tenure, and I remember distinctly that piece. And there were 140 or so drawings.
Yeah, I had this series where I would, on my lunch break, I would do these circular drawings with rubber cement, and I did one every day for a full work year. And then that piece didn't show all, I was still making the drawing, so it wasn't the full stack, but it was a stack of all the drawings I had completed to that point. And then with this video projected behind it of like rubber cement falling out of the container. Yeah, that was
conceptual in nature, and kind of going back to that first experience with Greeley Myatt's work, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I kind of fluctuate, like that piece that I showed on the slides before of the new Yes Yes. That's like a little more just like formally driven, and then some of my work I push pretty far conceptually, and I kind of fluctuate back and forth, and I don't feel an allegiance to one approach or the other. I think it's important to let them slide sort of into each other over time. And part of my reason I work in series over long stretches of time. So if you go into the next slide, this is another piece from the Ship Minerva series time period, I guess, that the olive branch piece in this year Delta is from. And so I thought I would talk a little bit, real briefly, about this series in general. So if you go to the next slide, this one sort of has relatively the same timeline as the Yes Yes series. It started around the beginning of the teens. And at that time, I had just gotten my first smartphone, and like Twitter was taking off, and Twitter was already taken off, but like the usage of hashtags started in 2007, but really was like picking up steam at like 2010, 2011. And so I was just kind of thinking about that. And then this is one of the early pieces in this series, and it's sort of more formal in approach. Wasn't really thinking about it like conceptually, just sort of like hashtag repetition, let's see what happens, and sort of more free form work. And then if you go to the next slide, I kind of jump forward a lot of years if you count all the years it took me to make the piece, but just a few years in terms of when I started it. And what I skip with this slide is, again, when I was working at Crystal Bridges, that same time period, I worked in the prep department. So one of my jobs was like in the morning to go around and just get the galleries ready, like clean up anything, make sure anything needs looked at. And there was a Jasper Johns alphabets painting there that I was enamored with that year. So I started thinking about that in relationship to a hashtag. And if you jump forward one more slide, that piece that we were just on, which was in the Delta 2 years ago, this was its sort of reference piece, gray alphabets. So that piece was called Carbon Alphabets, and this one is gray. And I was just thinking about, Jasper Johns in his alphanumeric paintings is sort of like by repetition, the forms become abstracted, and you start more and more to lose meaning of what they are in terms of like a literal usage of them, but also by repeating them. If you look at the B towards the bottom, it's different than the B at the top, etc. And so thinking about that and what that meant in terms of like social media with an individual using the hashtag, and then like being a part of this larger ecosystem of millions or billions of people using it, and just sort of losing track of like the individual within these larger systems, and like what that means in relationship also to language. So that's sort of what I was thinking about more and more as the series developed. And if you jump forward, this is a newer piece. It's really hard to read in photograph on this because I use a super hard lead. It's a 4H lead mechanical pencil. So I wanted this sort of like desert washed out feel to it. And I was kind of I was thinking about a few other art history references I could make. Like if you jump forward a slide, these are a couple of points of departure. This is a newer Peter Haley painting that I think has a nice relationship with that previous drawing, but I was thinking more about his work in the 80s, which basically looks like this with slightly less fluorescent paints. And that was really considering like early computer circuitry started, sort of the formative years of like interconnected, computer-driven techno society, and the sort of juxtapositioning that to this Agnes Martin sort of desert high philosophy, like mid-century modernist, like ideals, and sort of just kind of using both of those points of reference in that last drawing to raise some more questions about like, what are we doing with this technology?
Were you a particular fan of Thelma and Louise? What's the?
I think I just wanted to use the metaphor of them driving the car off the cliff, and like
Yeah.
like pushing towards like Thelma and Louise's self-driving car, and like what is this technology developing
Yeah.
at a speed that is heading towards a cliff drop off, which we're seeing. And then if you jump forward again, this is another iteration of how this series, so this series, I almost am reluctant to keep the ship Minerva tag, but all of the themes are unified. It's just they kind of pop up in different representations. And this one, again, like another Jasper Johns reference, he's kind of like my spiritual guide on this series. So if you jump forward one more slide, the point of reference on this is the Rosetta Stone. So I have a few other of these that take these language stones and use their outlines as the container for these hashtags to be drawn out. And then the name Stone on Valentine's is sort of a reference to like a country music song using like the word stoned for being drunk. And then this Jasper Johns piece, which I forget who it was, but some artist was like, if you signed a beer can, you could probably just sell that. He literally just like cast a couple beer cans, but then he painted the Valentine on there. And I like the relationship of the like that plinth kind of having a real rough, almost stone-like appearance to it. So yeah, those are just a few different ways that comes through. And then you can jump forward, and I'll just blast through this just so we don't get too far ahead of time. Here's the piece we have this year. Jump forward again. It's another piece. So I think I showed all of them in the slideshow, but I just wanted, there's 4 major truck stops, and that's the point of reference for all these. There's the TA, Travel J, Pilot, and Loves. And so sort of an inside joke to myself, like when I started this form of this Ship Minerva series, I was just commuting a lot. So like this was my actual physical space where these highway signs constantly. And then I also just thought it was a really stupid allusion to like the idea of like the information superhighway. But I think it also like more seriously is dealing with the same idea of like pulling in and pulling out like large scale individual versus systems. All these truck stops, there's only 4, they all have the same signage, they all look relatively the same, but then when you actually stop at them and go in, there's different chip brands, like the architecture is slightly different. So it's like when you zoom in, you can see all these differences, but when you zoom out, it's all kind of this like monolith of culture. And then jump forward, a couple art history references. I love the Ed Ruscha reference in the initial Delta conversation. And I was definitely thinking about Ed Ruscha as I was making this, especially his photographic series of gas stations, this and the one he did specific to like Shell stations. Mm-hmm. And then jump forward one more. I was just thinking about modes of like repetition in pop art versus like a post-minimalist art, and just sort of smashing those directly together, because I think conceptually they're kind of coming from a lot of the same places, but obviously representationally they end up in totally different places. So I kind of just wanted to force those 2 things together.
That repetition, the order of it, while these are 2 completely different works, there is that similarity in its construction.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think they both kind of, like a lot of my work, I work in series, I work over time through years, like repetition is a huge part of my practice. And I think the primary reason, or one of the primary reasons I employ it, is through repetition, you start to see these moments where, where one is like totally different than the other, like the little subtle differences start to pop up more and more as you like repeat them over.
And I know when we chatted earlier, I asked if that repetition was almost meditative for you, and you had kind of an interesting answer in response. So
yeah, I think I said it was more painful than
yeah, punishment.
Yeah, punishment.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think I sort of walked back on that a little bit, but when it comes to like the yes, yes series repetition, it is like pure punishment because it's so hard to get those to work. It's really easy for the tape to, do something, mess up and once you mess up, like that drawing is like in the trash, you can't go back. Like the tape rips the paper up. And on that one that the Art Center acquired, that's like the third version of that because the two before that, we got pretty far along and then messed up and had to restart completely. But with like the ship Minerva, especially the one that was in the Delta 2 years ago, that was it, when I started. Well, when I like picked it back, I started it in 2015 and picked it back up a couple of years later, like more aggressively. And when I picked it back up, I was just working. I was right out of grad school, and I was just working a bunch of like service industry jobs, like 70 hours a week. I just did not have time to do artwork. And that was a mode that I found that I could jump in and out of really quick without having to like think about it too much. And that actually was, I'm hesitant to say meditative, but it was nice. Like it was a nice escape from
An outlet, therapeutic.
Exactly. I was just like, I'm going in to make these marks for 15 minutes before I have to go do this. Like I can just shut down for a little bit.
Yeah. And you're using the same symbol over and over and over again. So it was pretty standard.
Yeah. It's kind of like those cartoons of like, Sylvester in like prison. He's like scratching the counting down the days in prison.
So we want to wrap up. Do we want to hit the next, the St. Rose, and then open it up for some questions?
Sure, yeah, that was just a stopping point. That's the last truck stop series.
And this is the most recent one, yes?
That was the very first one.
This was the first one, okay.
Yeah, and it's slightly even smaller, 5x7 version. And I still have this series going. So this is where I'm bringing the fast food symbols in.
Oh, Dairy Queen.
The scale is slightly different from like the smaller truck stop scales. I brought my props with me.
But you envision continuing to use signs like these of various types?
I haven't fully figured out how, like, conceptually to tie that up. Like, I don't want to push it out without thinking about it too far. Because I don't want to lose sort of the origins of the series.
Right.
I do know that there's a few fast food symbols for sure. Like this is the second. I have a Burger King one too. This is Dairy Queen.
Yeah, I recognized it immediately.
Yeah, I love this one though because it really, like, the symbol starts to sort of morph as you look at it longer. Different, kind of has like a Pacific Northwest Seahawk style vibe to it. Past fast food and truck stops, I haven't felt comfortable with any other signage that really works for me within.
Okay. Want to open it up for some questions?
Be great.
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat. Someone asked, when you use string or wool as line, how do you affix them to your art piece? Is it only the tape? Do you glue them or anything to hold them in place?
Sure, yeah, it is just the tape. So I'll basically, I don't know if this will show up in a camera, but I'll take the string, let me get a Post-it note, and I'll stretch it across the paper. And then I'll use other pieces of tape past the points of beginning or termination of the line and then so that'll be suspended on this paper, and then I'll literally have to very carefully drop the piece of tape on it without moving the string and without misfiring where the tape lands. And then once that's on there, I take the burnish and I burnish the tape down really good so it won't pull off of the paper. And so far,
So you're also trying to counteract the static.
Yeah, definitely. That's when, like in the one the Art Center acquired, when you have multiple strings like that, that's when it gets really hard because the tape will try to pull the string up off where I have it stretched.
Mm-hmm.
So one will catch, and then by the time I press it down, they like all tangled up, and then I can pull away sometimes and go down, but if I push down too far and it gets on the paper, it tears and you can't, it's over.
You said that was the third version of that work. Yeah.
And I broke a lot of these along the way from throwing them on the ground in anger.
Okay, someone else has asked, besides Jasper Johns, what other 20th century artists have influenced your work?
Sure. Yeah, I love Jasper Johns. I like Jasper Johns and Ed Ruscha both because I like that they refuse to answer a lot of questions about their artwork. Like, I don't think you can get away with that anymore, nor do I really fully think you should be able to get away with that anymore. But I do love that in that period of time, they would take sort of the vernacular of, you know, signs and symbols and culture that's around them and put them into their work in these very sort of like obscure ways, and then just ask the general public to deal with the mystery of what they were doing. And so I find generally the artists like that I gravitate towards, that sort of like have this sort of mysterious quality to them while using popular symbols of their, or not popular symbols, but like while absorbing whatever the cultural phenomena around them is. I also do love Agnes Martin a lot. I actually don't think I love Jasper Johns as much as I realized in this lecture. It seems like I do, because he's almost the only person I reference, but it's just because he really is like the impetus for a lot of the Ship Minerva series, which is the bulk of this. I'm blanking now on other one. I like Gene Davis. I like a lot of the DC. I have a series called DC Sports Writer, which was in a couple of deltas, which is a slight reference to Gene Davis, but I like the Washington School painters a lot, Kenneth Noland. Yeah, I don't know. A bunch of them. I really like that era of work. I like Frank Stella's like first few years. Then I don't like much of his later work. I like Donald John Judd's like, or wait, no, not Donald Judd, Carl Andre's poetry work, where he just uses repetition of typed words to like create these scenes. Yeah, that's, I don't know, I could go on for a while, but yeah, I like that era generally. And I've slowly started to actually like Andy Warhol. I go back and forth on him. Depends on the weather, I guess.
Someone has asked, since you're using tape, do you ever think about how those works will withstand time, since tape doesn't typically preserve that well?
I do, and that's partly why I do to a certain extent. And that's partly why I switched to using archival bookbinding tape versus just using Scotch tape and wider like masking tapes and packing tape and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it still is tape, so there's only a certain point you can get to with it. The tapes I use are pH neutral, so they won't destroy the paper, which is good. There's at least, 60 to 100-year window on these drawings before they start to fall apart. And then if they start to fall apart, that's just, job security for paper conservators and stuff like that in the future. So I will say I was at a a drawing collection or a drawing show. I forget the name of it. It originated in Minneapolis. Anyway, I'm forgetting all the details, but I was at that show and it might have been like a Bryce Martin piece or something. Anyway, there's this piece from 1958-ish, and it had a piece of masking tape on it, and it looked perfect, and it was still on the paper, and I was like, great, I'm good. Like, if that's holding up, like, I'm not gonna worry about my tapes anymore.
Looking at this work, are you using erasure as part of your process as well?
Not unless I mess up, which I try not to do.
Okay.
These leads are pretty hard. Yeah, the gradations and the shifts in color are pressure related, and
okay.
Also sometimes, even though I like do block my hand off that's writing or drawing with another piece of paper, there can be with the softer lead some like smearing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, someone has asked, do you draw out the shapes before you fill them in with the hashtags, or you just go for it?
I draw them out, yeah. So it starts by sketching out, like on these, I'll start by doing a Google image search and try to find, like I purposefully want to pull images, like I don't want to go out and shoot an image of a sign myself, and then, because I would have too much control of the situation. So I purposefully go and just source / rip off and steal images I can find off Google of people who, for whatever reason, have taken photographs of truck stop signs. And then I'll have that source image and I'll draw it out to reduce it down to just a few shades, like bring it to a relatively simplistic drawing of the sign, and then I'll finish that, clean it up a little bit, and transfer it onto the actual panel that I'm going to draw on, or a piece of paper I draw on, and then I have those lines dictate. Because the way that I feel like whatever, I'll give away all my secrets. Like the way that I change it's all dependent on pencil lead weight. So this one has I use mechanical pencils, and it has 4 different weights. And so all the shades are just dependent on how soft or hard the lead is. So where the lines, like you can see in the detail shot of this, where the lines of my drawing are transferred on to the final piece, I'll just sort of halfway do a hashtag symbol with a 4H lead, and then the other part of it will be with like B lead or something. So you can really see it in this detail here, where a hashtag will be like half and half, one hardness or softness of the lead.
That kind of goes along with this other question. After you're done with the Ship Minerva series and you're finished with the hashtags, would you consider doing a series where you're writing actual words or putting actual messages and making your artwork with that?
I don't think so. I mean, part of this is directly related to the proliferation of language in the social media landscape, and to use like specific language, I think would take away from a larger questioning of what and how is language shifting as like a tool. And the hashtags are referencing that, but they're also, I mean, before, like, it's funny because I call it hashtag and everyone does, but I mean, it's not, I think it's called like an octa norm, or there's like some term for this actual symbol. Before it was a hashtag, for me, it was always a £, which was like a numeric indicator. And then I also loosely, like in the larger pieces, when I see this symbol, I kind of think of like a cross stitch. And so that's why those are in like a larger like small textile scale. And so for me to have the ability to convey a possibility, like a bunch of different possible interpretations is important. That if I was literal, you would just lose that. It would just be the message that I was getting across, or whatever my source materials or whatever language I was using would dominate the composition too much, and I think it would all kind of fall apart.
Hey, someone has asked, is the 7x5 the smallest piece you've done?
Of the Ship Minerva series, yeah, it is, and it's the first one, and that was literally the size of the panel that I had. Like I 6x8. I like the 5x7, 6x8 scale in relationship to photography. That sort of small size. But yeah, the 5x7 one is just slightly too small. This one's a keeper for me. This is my permanent collection now.
I don't know if we have any other questions, but one I wanted to ask before we close is, you've appeared in 9 deltas going back to 2008, and I think that was the first year you said you entered. So over the last 12, you've made it into 9 of them, including a 5-year straight run. Yeah. Which is pretty impressive because, as you know, we have guest jurors every year and it's a completely blind process. So for your work to resonate with so many different jurors consistently over the years, I think is a testament. But can you speak a little about the Delta and how it's kind of shaped you as an artist, and especially being from Little Rock, to make it into the Delta?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of where we started with this, like the Delta was very important to me in my formative years, like just that exposure to contemporary artwork. And so, I live in North Carolina now. I live that pyramid cylinder show. I was living in Seattle at the time. I've moved all around, but regardless of where I am, like the Delta is something I always try to apply for, and if I can, I come home for the opening. Like I want to meet other artists who are in it and sort of just like get back in the community and see everybody. So it's a really special exhibit for me. It's something that like I'll continue to try to apply and get into as we move, as I keep getting older and stuff. It's regardless of what I'm doing in my life or something. It's sort of like at this point, it's been around in my life for so long. It's like part of like my yearly cycle. And so to be able to, like, I'm surprised that I've gotten in as many as I have, just because my work is like abstract and drawing, and it's like I can see how it's like sort of universal because of that, but also sometimes like it doesn't quite fit in with like the idea of like a Southern vernacular or whatever. So I can see that, like I can see how it could not make it in. So I've been surprised to be as consistent as I have been in it. I mean, it's like super cool to have been in this many, gotten to like have it a part of my yearly routine that I'm also like actively a part of, as opposed to just showing up to. Yeah. So it's really cool.
Well, hopefully next year we'll be able to go back to those in-person receptions and an in-person exhibition. But as an institution, we were committed to ensuring the continuity of the Delta this year. So we were able to do it virtually and, in fact, reach more people through conversations like this, as opposed to traditional gallery talks.
Yeah. No, I'm really grateful for this platform, because if it had been a gallery talk, I don't know if I would have been able to like get off work and make it out there.
Yeah,
I only had to take off like an hour or two today, which is great. And,
yeah,
perfect. So I'm thankful for that.
Okay, we have just the one more question, and that's, do you have any works currently at another Little Rock gallery?
I do. I work with Boswell Moreau, and I know the amount of work I have currently there is not that many pieces, but I know I still have work there. I'm hoping to get some newer work there sometime soon if traveling ever opens back up in a real way. But for the time being, I know I have some work. I think there's a few early Yes Yes small pieces in there, if I remember correctly. But yeah, Boswell Moreau, they have some of my work still there, so definitely a place to see it. I also, now that I'm thinking of it, not in Little Rock, but that first Delta piece that I showed is up at, this isn't very specific, but at the Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, they acquired a lot of my work. I think they bought, Townsend Wolfe was in charge of procuring work for this one health science building that was being built in 2010. And so there's like 20 of my pieces, because I was so young, they could just buy all my artwork for nothing at the time. And so there's a lot of my early works up in Jonesboro. Those are two places that I know to see stuff up right now. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I don't think we have any more questions. Lindsay, Raina, do you want to close it out? You want me to close it out? Well, Louis, thank you so much for your time. This has been fascinating. I'll look forward to seeing what you enter for the Delta next year. Plan on a December call for entry, so start working.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. It was really, really interesting.
And thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Definitely.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Stay well. Bye.